And as I told you last week, these lectures, all three of them actually, are on the interface between science and philosophy, and they're going more and more into philosophy. And there are things that I feel strongly about, and there are things that I offer as a possibility for consideration, for arguments. All right. So I want to discuss today free will and beyond. So hopefully this will be two parts of the lecture. The first part will be free will, and second part will be beyond. So my own view is that the free will problem issue is overrated as a problem, and philosophers, contemporary philosophers, say it's kind of a scandal that we're still arguing about free will. And I agree, but for other reasons. For me, free will, as a scientist, I've already given you my perspective on science, it's kind of settled. Okay, but anyway, that's not everybody thinks so. So that will be the first part. To me, the more interesting and the more challenging part is what do we do with it? What do we do after we settle the free will issue? How do we conceptualize a coherent concept of selfhood, humanity, and so on and so forth? These are, to me, the more challenging problems. And I'll discuss those, hopefully, today in the last part of the lecture, and conclude further thoughts about it next week, the final lecture. All right, so free will, we already introduced it in the first lecture of the course as a kind of a motivating theme. And I want to remind you that what enters into, okay, so first of all, what is free will? So what I'm going to discuss the debate about free will in the strong sense. You can call it strong free will, metaphysical free will, or libertarian free will. Free will that really has the strong intuitive sense. So let's try to unpack what this entails. So there are many things, but there are four items. So the first one is that what's called principle of open alternatives. The idea is that somehow the physical world, the world of action and the consequences and so on and so forth, is not completely closed. It's not determined. Because if it's determined, then there is no freedom. There is nothing for us to do. So there is some element of openness in the world. We'll discuss what possibilities are there for this openness. So that's one thing. You can call it some indeterminacy in the world. Second is that whatever this openness is, we are able to come in and influence the fate of events with our will. Okay, so the will is causally efficacious. It has causal power. So the kind of metaphor is a kind of fork. So we walk through our lives, we get to a junction, is a fork A, fork B. In principle, we could choose A or could choose B. It's kind of open. The future is still open, although the past is given. And at that point, we choose by our free will A, then things go this way, or we choose B, then things go the other way. And another metaphor which is related to it is kind of rolling back the movie. So if we chose A, and we will roll back the video, so to speak, of the universe, and come back to the same point, the same junction, we could have chosen B, and then the trajectory of the world would be B. That's kind of the metaphor that people and philosophers have in mind, kind of the strong sense of free will. There are other aspects which I would like to discuss, at least the relation between, briefly, the relation between free will and consciousness, because the traditional view is that this free will is a conscious process. And finally, the more challenging aspect, which I'll devote, hopefully, the time when I talk about beyond, is the relation between free will and human agency and responsibility. And the sense, the libertarian free will, at least, not only them, but those have, most of them feel very strongly about the link between this freedom of the choice and the sense of agency. So we own our action. We chose A over B, then whatever consequences come out of that choice is up to us. It's written in our account. We are agents that act in the world in an important sense. So it's a sense of autonomy, a sense of ownership, and a sense of responsibility. We deserve credit if we did the right choice. We deserve blame or punishment if we did the wrong choice. So we are responsible for our action, because our action is not simply it's not simply the product of some natural processes, molecules go back and forth, ions flowing into our brain, photons impinge on our eyes. Whatever it means, we are agents acting in the world freely, and those action generates relation, kind of responsibility, ownership. Okay. So these are kind of the strong sense of why we should, on first glance, hold very dearly to that concept of freedom. Okay. So let's try to unpack it. Principle of open alternatives and the causal efficacy of the will are kind of related. And there are several open possibilities that are in the literature. One popular idea is that the future, physical future, is really open because of quantum indeterminacy. And therefore, furthermore, our choice, which is uncaused, in other words, that there are really junctions where quantum mechanics says there's a probability that electron will jump to this state A, or probability that electron will jump to energy level B, and that has this kind of consequences. And our choice fill in the gap. Okay, so you have both in one package. You have the openness, and there is an influence of our choice to kind of set the actual outcome of the universe. All right. What can we say briefly about it? We already discussed it. I'll just say briefly. The only known source of genuine indeterminacy is indeed quantum. So if we really want to have kind of an openness from within physics, then statistical physics of chaos and so on are not really giving the goods, because they have to do with predictability and so on and so forth, but they're not really genuine openness. The universe is not open. However, quantum mechanics, as we explained it is really probabilistic and really predicts there are some events, quantum events, that are not causally determined. Okay, we already discussed to what extent quantum indeterminacy have important role on the behavioral level. Normally not, but there are rare conditions, like you are in a very dark night, no other source of light, and there is a flash, dim flash of light with a few photons, and then you may perceive or not perceive, or you may press a button or not, depending on something which ultimately you can say it's a quantum indeterminacy, the number of photons that. Okay, so this is not something that we should rule out. So, however, what is problematic, as we discussed, is that although we can say, okay, so in that sense, the quantum physical world is not really closed. There are these junctions going A or B. However, quantum mechanics does not allow a force called free will to close this gap. So if I mean, to say that the free will is determining what the electron will do is basically to violate the rules of quantum mechanics. So that's obvious problem in my mind. So to that avenue, but okay. So this is the first item. Okay, so against quantum mechanics, essentially. There are other arguments about this issue. One of them is emergent causation. We already discussed it. The idea is that human consciousness and free will are emergent properties of the brain processes. And once they are emergent properties, they have their own causal powers. And these causal powers not only affect the mental states, but they affect also the physical state. So we act, we change the physical world, we transfer energy and momentum and so on and so forth because of the emergent causation. Okay, so in other words, the physical world is open not because the micro laws are not deterministic, but because they are susceptible to influences from the macro emergent world. Okay, we discussed at length emergent causation, kind of downward causation, which I already discussed in previous lectures, why, in my view, it's unacceptable. Finally, there is a version of that, which is called agent causation. It is somewhat different from emergent causation because, as we saw in previous lectures, emergent causation is a more sweeping statement. It's not only about free will, it's not only about consciousness, it's about any sufficiently complex physical system, macro scale, patterns evolve in kind of an independent causal laws. Agent causation is kind of says, well, no, but we or maybe other agents from Mars or whatever, we are special. We have something which is self. And this part of the world, there are electrons, there are quarks, there are ions, there are atoms, there are also self, human agents, and they have their own causal power. It's a kind of emergent causation, but more subtle, more specific to human and alike, that have some entities which are self, agents, selfhood, and so on. So in any case, I think it's again the same problem as in downward causation. Anything that you say about a force that influences the physical world is physics, whether you call it agent or you call it emergent and so on, or free will, or the mind, or spirit, or soul. It has to conform into the physical set of laws that we know from physics. Okay, that's at least in my view. So these are the main themes that you'll find in the literature, and in my view, all of them are problematic because of this reason. Let me just add briefly about consciousness. And basically, I just want to make two brief comments about that. One comment is, although I said that to me, the strong sense of free will is a conscious process, but there are some thinkers that say, who said so? Maybe we are free and we decide freely, we choose freely, subconsciously. So in the context, for instance, of Libet experiment that Ariel and Liad discussed previously in the lecture, some said, okay, so what is the problem? So there is this willing time when we are aware of our choice, but there is a readiness potential time, which is earlier, and that was conceived to be a problem for free will. But so no, maybe the readiness potential is the outcome of our free choice. Okay, I don't want to get into it. To me, it's kind of not plausible. But anyway, another issue which I want to kind of set aside is people somehow mix or conflate the problem of free will with the problem of consciousness. And I want to kind of disambiguate this relation, because as we discussed, I think last time, consciousness, the problem of consciousness has two parts. One is kind of the easy part, which is like any other kind of mental processes, and the other one is the kind of hard part. Okay, why we have this kind of subjective perspective, experiential, qualia, and so on and so forth. To me, the free will problem or issue is simpler in the sense that whatever we have, whatever stand we have, whatever position we adopt about kind of hard problem of consciousness, is it real, is it not, is it illusory, whatever. The free will belongs, in my view, to the easy part, because the free will is about acting in the world. It is about something that has consequences in the physical world, consequences that we can all observe and measure and so on. So, for me, free will is relatively simple problem in the sense that it is about what kind of possible explanation we have for interaction of the mental on the physical, rather than something which is completely internal to our kind of subjective world, which is the qualia and so on and so forth. So this is why I think the hard problem of consciousness is you can argue back and forth, and I don't know, I don't have a strong opinion about it, but I don't think it has to do necessarily with the problem of free will. At least that's my view. All right. So basically, following the argument that I led you intentionally or not throughout the course, there is a deep inconsistency between a strong notion of free will and the scientific perspective on what are causal powers that change states or change events in the physical world. And that's again the microphysical closure of the physics. All causes of events in the physical system are accounted for by the local and universal forces acting upon the microconstituents of the system. And that's in charge of emergent, macro, and everything. It's not reducible in practice, but very often. But it is in principle in principle there the relation. So anything that acts upon the physical world and changes it has to respond to critique which comes from physics and experimental, empirical, universality, symmetry, and so on and so forth. All right, so this is, okay, in my view at least, rather convincing argument why that intuitively attractive and strong notion of free will is inconsistent with a scientific perspective on the world. All right. There is another issue which I don't want to go into it because it's kind of more philosophical issue, and okay, you can argue about it. There is a long history of debates in philosophy whether the concept of free will itself is coherent, regardless of science, regardless of what you think about quantum mechanics or whether the physical world is closed or not. It's conceptually inconsistent. And the reason basically is that these two, if I go back to these first two items, the fact that we believe things are open and then we believe that our will chooses seem to contradict each other, because if you think that we have a will and we have a reason and we deliberate, and that determines whether the world will go in the A path or in the B path, then again, it's determined. It's just another, maybe non-physical, but another way that the world is determined. So the notion of freedom and the notion of will, of causally effective will, doesn't seem to be consistent conceptually. What does it mean for will? If you think your will is there, maybe it's not physical, maybe it's spiritual, man, whatever it is, angels. But then angels determine how the world will act, will evolve. So that's, again, we can argue back and forth. There is a long history of debates about this issue. And you can find, you will Google it and find, interesting arguments back and forth. Even contemporary philosophy, is the concept of free will coherent at all? Okay, I don't want to make a strong stand or take a position about this. I don't know. You start to elaborate on what this means and what that means. But my own, I'm emphasizing the inconsistency in my view between the free will, the notion of free will, and our perspective on the physical world, our best approximate view of the physical world. So I just want to mention that there is another more fundamental or more basic question about underlying the very notion of free will. Okay. So if actions are determined by mental causes, then they're not free. So in what sense they're free? All right. So what are other options that you will find in the literature of thinkers that are influential and really, in some cases, devoted their life to think about this problem? So there are many. I won't go into all of these. I just mentioned a few that you should know as a general culture. Number one is kind of interesting. It weakens the notion of free will. And it says uncaused action, let's say quantum mechanically, is free. In other words, you don't have to have the causally effective will in order to have free will. So particularly Robert Cain, a famous philosopher, adopted a version of that where his opinion was that usually we are not free, we act because we are biased psychologically, biologically, physiologically, but there are occasions in our life where we are confronting a junction, where we are deliberating, like the picking versus choosing dilemmas that we discussed earlier on with Ariel and Liat again, but not picking, but really choosing heavily important junctions in our life. What important moral dilemma, or what to study at the university, what career path to take, what partner to choose, and so on and so forth. And let's imagine that in those cases, we have now dilemma between two options, and both of them seem reasonable to us. So there are two neural circuits. One circuit says A, another circuit says B, but they are kind of equally strong in their activity. And let's imagine that in these cases, because those two electrical activities are very equal, then maybe a quantum event tips the scale. Okay, and you decide, or that event decides for you B, not A. So it's kind of interesting combination. On one hand side, you deliberated, and the brain was going back and forth. On the other hand, the choice was really a random event, quantum mechanical event. So Robert Kane called them self-forming alternatives, okay? And according to him, because you basically endorse, in your deliberation, you endorse both options, because the both options were equally reasonable to you. You couldn't make up your mind until this quantum event decided for you. So it belongs to you. It is, you endorsed either A or both of them look to you reasonable. So although the decision was a random event, it's not that your will decided, but because your will endorse, your deliberation endorsed both options, then it's you can say it belongs to you. It's your decision. Okay, we can argue about it, but again, that's, to me, it takes out the essence of the conflict between free will and physics in the causal, in attributing causal powers to the will. If you take them, it remains a philosophical question. Okay, so that's the idea of acausal free will. So the principle of open alternatives, according to this, are important, because otherwise there is no, what do you deliberate? Everything goes straightforward. So there is some openness. However, even though the decision is done by random physical events, it's good enough. All right. There is another philosophical school, which I don't want to elaborate on, but just to mention it, that we are free to will, but not to choose, or not to act. So action is acting in the physical world, is subject to the physics, chemistry, and biophysics, to all the physical rules, but willing is kind of mental. So you're free to will. You're free, there is no rules that determine what you will think, what you will desire, what you will wish. All right, so that's again kind of acausal. Either the willing is a causal power on the acting, then it doesn't address anything. But if you think the willing is kind of independent, something mental, spiritual, subjective, whatever, then again it takes the Ockett's gist out of the free will as a causal power, something that really acts in the world. I have a problem with it on several, multiple levels. For instance, willing, again, is a mental process, but we can actually look at your brain and see the electrical activities. So again, unless you say, well, I'm referring to the subjective will, which is the half of consciousness, the qualia, which is whatever it is, it's inert, causally inert, then fine, then we leave it in kind of the acausal department. But if you think that those willing is, generates electrical activity in the brain, then even if they don't generate action, they generate electrical activity, and that's action. So the whole notion that the brain is closed from the world, action is moving muscles, but thinking is something not. I think it's it's false, because you know, all the brain activity is really something which is
Thinking is moving ions.
exactly as physical as moving muscles and you know, driving your car and so on and so forth. So you know, maybe classical pre-scientific view of things, it made sense, but not in modern science. Yeah, moving ions is as physical as moving chairs and drinking coffee and so on.
I think an interesting question that I saw um, that was posed is, why do we feel that we have this super strength?
Who is talking? Adam?
Now, yeah.
So can you repeat the question?
So I think that a very interesting question is, why do we feel that we have this super strength called free will?
Okay, we'll come to it. But right now we are, I want to set aside or to close the discussion about the idea that free will is really something there. It's not just we feel like that. It's we feel, but we feel like that because it is there in strong sense. Okay, there are some more, again, more kind of philosophical side, Kantian view and neo-Kantians that kind of, we have to accept the fact that the world is consists of two perspectives which are not compatible. One, the physical, deterministic, causal perspective, another one is kind of the psychological, mental, subjective. Okay, whether it's consistent or coherent or not, there is books and articles and careers. But again, to me, it's kind of more hardcore philosophy. I don't think it's it sits nicely with a coherent kind of incompatible perspectives. I think they should be avoided.
But why can't we combine 1 and 3 and say that instead of saying that the quantum state would be totally a random event, we would say, well, the quantum event which will draw us the action is actually this non-deterministic and what's self-caused event, or whatever is this, like ex nihilo event, which is in the Kantian sense, the dualistic, like not out of this world, but still we have like, we can, sorry. So why can't say like, get the first explanation of the causal free will, but instead of saying the quantum state or quantum change is a random event, we just say that it's like, it's not like, it's like God playing dice, not like just random.
I do not have any problem.
I'm just thinking about it. I don't know if that's consistent view. That's my question.
Okay, let me finish. I do not have any problem if somebody comes up and say, look, there are random events, quantum mechanics, or undetermined, uncaused because of probabilities, quantum indeterminacy. And so electrons has to decide whether it goes to A and B, and the electron thinks and makes a decision. Okay, so, and let's call it free will. That's fine. I mean, I'm not against that. I'm against the idea that the decision of the electron, whether to be in that level or this level, is different in my brain than it is in the dish or inside the microscope or inside the accelerator or whatever apparatus I measure. That's my problem. If somebody wants to embed the entire quantum world with spirituality, be my guest, because this doesn't change anything about quantum laws. So I'm open to all kinds of ideas, crazy or not crazy. There are these panpsychism ideas that everything has consciousness and everything. But as long as this ideas, these thoughts, don't make any statements that deviate from what we know about physics. In other words, that whatever influences the quantum events in my brain are the same influences that will affect the quantum events in your brain, or also in an inanimate, not living, just, you know, a quantum system that I run in experiment in the Radcliffe Institute of Physics. This is fine. Then you want to call it free will, fine. But if somebody says, look, quantum events are random, okay, but now the electron or the ion in the membrane in the nervous system in human beings or complex animals behave differently. Okay, so that's my problem. Then I see a problem. Okay.
Well, that's exactly which I wanted to make with taking the third point. That's why it's not in one, but 1 and 3 combined, to say, yes, our electron in our brain can have influences of different physics than the electron in my dish, is because I'm taking year 3 that there's another reality there's another whatever force, dualistic force, yes, which is a different aspect of reality. That's why I need number 3.
Okay, you are just.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about it aloud. I'm just like I want to have feedback if that's consistent for you.
Yeah, I'm just saying I don't think this is something which will save the problem of physics. Okay, but there are people that are upfront dualists, and they say, well, with all due respect to what you believe is physics and microphysics and so on, we think otherwise. And you know, physics, that's fine. I mean, I'm just saying that it's still not compatible with what our view about physics. You know, I got the shot of vaccine. You know, hopefully it will help. You know, macroscopically and so on. It's all based on the idea, on the basic. The reason why I took the shot and believe that it will help me is because there was an experiment done in the dish. So if we believe that those molecules behave differently when they are injected into my arm, then they behave in the dish, then we will not believe in any of this, right? Okay. That's all what I'm saying.
I mean, I think in my case, it's less strong than that, because my, I don't know, idea or whatever thought process was, what if the quantum states of where the electrons or the ions and where they go, it's entangled somehow, magically or dualistically, with our, let's say, conscious decision process. So it happens to be that every time we decide to go A, also the quantum states also goes A. It's like entangled, like it's even a quantum experiment that it knows where to what the other electron or with the other ions went to. Like we know quantum entanglement, that's such a. So let's assume that our conscious experience of decision would be entangled with the quantum states. Yes, and right. I agree. It's definitely a somehow dualistic view. Yes, what I'm expressing, or dualistic idea, what I'm expressing, that let's say the conscious decision, conscious mental state of a decision is kind of entangled with the quantum state. But my question is, okay, maybe that's a dualistic idea, but is it a consistent idea to think of such a thing?
Well, I again, fine. I mean, maybe other people want to make comments on that. I just want to understand the words. You're saying dualistic and you're saying entanglement. If it's dualistic, then you're saying, okay, Haim, you believe in monism. You believe that the physical world, what influences it is physics, and not something. Whatever influences it is part of physics, but you are saying dualistic. So I don't know what you mean by that. So if you mean that the electron in my brain or the ion is entangled with my consciousness or my whatever, then I would say quantum mechanics does not allow entanglement with consciousness. It's allowing entanglement with other electrons or other spins or other. You have to give an account. So, but if you say no, quantum mechanics is wrong because it's also entangled with consciousness. So why worry about all this entanglement? You just say quantum mechanics is wrong, and there are influences which are not part of quantum mechanics. So I don't understand the combination. I don't understand the motivation of this combination. That's what I'm saying. If you're dualistic, then fine. You're dualistic. You know, you can say sorry. There are macroscopic forces, which you call consciousness, which determine what the electron will do, which are not reducible to kind of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth. That's fine. That's a position. I don't think it's consistent with my view of what science is, or what science tells us about the world, but that's a dualistic statement. But I don't understand why you have to go through entanglement. Entanglement is also a physical process. It's not a magical process. And we know what entanglements are. But there is nothing like consciousness. Consciousness has to be other electrons, other things which interact with these electrons. So I just don't understand that statement. But anyway, if you want to hold dualism, that's fine. I subscribe very strongly to monism because for dualism is slippery road, and for a variety of reasons which we can discuss later on. But so I think the physical world has a structure which was proven again and again, and of course we revise it and we correct it and all kinds of things. But anything so mundane as consciousness, it's not some monopole, magnetic monopole. Maybe somebody has been able to measure it. There may be one in the universe and revise electromagnetism to allow magnetic monopole, to those of you that know what it is. Or I don't know, some corrections to gravity by some measuring gravity waves. But willing and choosing, and something that we are doing all the time, maybe also other animals do all the time. So this is should be quite easy to measure in the lab. And if it's not in principle measurable in the lab, that's my problem. If it is something that entangles with my electron, which is not a phenomena that I can see in the lab, it's again physics. That's all my point. Okay, but all right. So let me just talk about the one comment, which is number 4, and this is basically saying the following: you cannot make sense of free will, your problem with science, and so on and so forth. However, you must believe in free will, because if you don't believe in free will, the consequences are horrible. So some consequences have to do with human agency and responsibility, and I'll come back to that. But some extreme statements is that the consequences is horrible because they're not rational. You cannot rationally deny free will. And that's an argument that, again, you hear it in popular science, but not only in popular science. This is a quote from Sir John Eccles, neuroscientist, Nobel laureate. discovered properties of synapses and so on. He was also religious person, Catholic, I think, and wrote a lot about issues about brain and free will and so on and so forth. And here I'm sure it's a very nice expression of that question, of that issue. To deny free will is neither rational nor a logical act, because this denial either presupposes free will for the deliberately chosen response in making that denial, which is a contradiction, or else it's merely an automatic response of a nervous system built by genetic code and modeled by conditioning, etc. In other words, how can you engage in a rational debate about free will unless you presuppose free will? Because if you're not a free agent, if you're just a pack of neurons and molecules, molecules don't debate with other molecules about anything. They just do whatever nature tells them to do. So some people find it a very forceful argument. But anyway, so that's, sometimes you hear about that also. No, I don't think it is true, but I think rational thinking doesn't necessarily mean free will in the strong sense, but that's kind of a sentiment. But, yes.
על מה שדיברת מקודם, אולי לא הבנתי אותך נכון, אבל אתה אמרת שבעיניך אפשר למדוד רצון ולבצע מדידה של רצון בעצם במעבדה? זה משהו שאפשר למדוד את המצב הפיזיקלי שלו?
לא, מה שאני אמרתי זה, אם רצון פועל על פעילות עצבית במוח, על נוירונים, יונים וכולי, במנגנונים שמוכרים לנו, אז בסדר, אז את המנגנונים האלה אנחנו יכולים לקחת למעבדה ולבדוק אותם, מה שעושים היום בנורוסיינס. אבל אם יש טענה שרצון זה משהו הוליסטי, שהוא לא קשור, הוא לא כבול לאלקטרוכימיה ולביופיזיקה ולפיזיקה, זה משהו אחר. ובכל אופן הוא משפיע על האלקטרונים והיונים והפעילות החשמלית במוח. אז זה כוח חדש בפיזיקה, אז שאני הייתי רוצה לדעת איך הוא פועל במעבדה. או אם יש לו, אם אפשר לפרק אותו למרכיבים במעבדה. ואם לא, אז בפיזיקה אנחנו לא מרשים דברים כאלה, שיהיו חוקים חדשים שאין להם, שלא נובעים מחוקי היסוד. זה פשוט לא קיים בעולם הקונספטים של פיזיקה.
סבבה, תודה.
זאת הכוונה.
זאת הכוונה.
Okay, so I'm not saying, so in response to Eden's question, what I'm not saying that the wheel is not affecting the electrical activity. What I'm saying is that if the mental process of willing affects the electrical activity through the known macroscopic laws of biochemistry and biology and so on, then we know that they are rooted by a microscopic fundamental laws which we can test. And that's what we do in neuroscience. We are saying, well, there is cellular and molecular processes, and that cellular molecular processes we actually take to the lab and measure them, right? Because we believe that the fundamental forces are reducers. So there is will, there is a macroscopic mental state, but it is a macroscopic state which is the outcome of a more microscopic level forces, and that's what we measure in the lab. And we want to kind of if we want to deconstruct the elementary forces. But if somebody said, no, free will is acting on my neurons, but in a way which is not constrained by the physics and biochemistry and so on, then in principle, there is nothing that they can test in the lab, because in the lab, this force doesn't exist. So as I said, I strongly believe that the physics is microscopically closed. There are no fundamental physical forces that act only on my brain or under certain complex situations, but they don't have any microscopic underpinning.
אז
Yes.
בעיניך זה רק עניין של זמן עד שהמדע ידע להגיד בדיוק למה בן אדם חושב כמו שהוא חושב, ולמה זה שונה מבעלי חיים, ולמה מחשבות ורצונות נוצרים? אם זו שאלה מדעית, בעיקרון, שהיא עדיין פתוחה?
אני לא חושב. Okay, so I think, Eden, you asked what Hadar asked. I wasn't going to discuss it in detail, but let's discuss it now. I think it's a good point. So, you know, I mean scientists and philosophers say free will is illusion. And then the question is, why do we have the feel of free will? Why we have that illusion? Well, if we have illusions, there are scientific explanations of the origin of that illusion, right? So for instance, if we have some optical illusion, then, psychology and then neuroscience and so on and so forth give explanation of the reason why we perceive something differently from what it's really out there. Let me just turn on my light. So it's a very common view. Free will is just illusion. There is no free will, it's illusion. And then what you said that then is right. Then science, to some degree, can explain it and so on. I don't think so. I don't think it's illusion. Okay. And I was going to talk about it in different order, but I can tell you now why I'm saying it. Sometimes we have illusion. Sometimes free will is illusion. For instance, sometimes I act unconsciously, but I'm conscious about my action only later on, and we can measure it. Sometimes the time of willing is after the acting, so it's clear that my conscious sense of choosing is illusion in that case, because the act was done before you chose. Okay, but I think
although Haim, also it depends what is the time scale that you request for, like something. If we think something microscopic is making this mental state, then it could happen, 10 microseconds afterwards, but it can happen a minute afterwards, like in the Libet experiment. So it depends, like.
Yeah. No, but I'm saying in the Libet experiment, there is the onset of the electrical activity, the onset of the readiness potential, subconsciously. Mm-hmm. Then there was the time of being aware of a choice, like the conscious choice, and then there was time of action, of movement. But in some circumstances, you can find that the time of willing is after the action.
I see.
Not like in Libet.
Okay.
Okay. In that cases, at least the conscious process was not acting in anything, right? Was after the action. But in most cases, what I'm saying, it's not so. In most cases, we are consciously planning and deliberating and deciding and then acting. So I don't think this is illusion. This is part of the process of the causal unfolding of events in the world through physics. But part of the physics is you deliberating and you choosing and you willing, and then you're acting as we can conceive the normal connection between cognition and neuroscience and evolution of patterns of activity. So it's not an illusion. It is a real mental process of choosing and deciding that very often, not always, very often is in charge or is causing our action.
But in a way, it's kind of a degenerate way to define free will. it's not like what we talked about it all what
Okay.
the philosopher
Okay,
talked.
I will come to it. So okay, so let's okay. Let me just say okay, so I'll jump. Okay, and I'll tell you okay, I'll tell you basically, okay. I'm going in the wrong order, but maybe we can regain the order. The fundamental question is the question of compatibilism, it's called. In other words, whether you think that free will is inconsistent with determinism, but determinism doesn't necessarily mean not quantum. Everything with the microclosure principle, as I said, whether determined or not. And what I described earlier was a tension, expression of a tension between them. On the other hand, there is an established school of thought, which I think makes a lot of sense, that the two aspects, free will and human agency, are compatible with determinism, that free will and determinism are not two parts of two sides of the road, but they are the same side. Okay. However, the notion of free will as something which is outside the deterministic causal chain is wrong. I don't think it is illusion. I'll tell you why. Okay, because it is. I myself, and I think many, when I make a decision, okay, I choose something. It is not that at the moment when I choose, I say, well, this is a miracle. I am God. I chose. I was free to choose. I don't think of myself like that. I don't have an illusion that I am extra naturalistic something. What is the sense that I do have? I do have the strong feeling that the process of choosing started now, which meant that everything that preceded that moment of conscious awareness is subconscious, did not reach my awareness. So there is a causal chain of events, okay? Let me give you an example, a metaphor. You have some damage to a tissue in the brain, God forbid, okay? You don't have any pain sensors in the brain, so you don't feel it. Then the doctor tells you, well, you have a problem. Benign, but anyway, okay? Is it an illusion? No. It is simply your lack of knowledge. There are things that you are not conscious of because you don't have information about them. When I make a choice, all of a sudden, my feeling is that the choice started now. Why? Because I don't have awareness of all the unconscious processes that led to my choice. This is the feeling. It's more an issue of ignorance, of all of a sudden now I am aware, ignorance in terms of my conscious. When things come to our consciousness is when we begin to be aware of what's going on. That's what we call free will. We call free will, we call them the process of willing or desiring or choosing consciously, which start a chain of events which are reached our awareness. But it's not that we are God and we started a chain of events independent of what went before that. It just, they didn't reach our awareness. To me, this is a much more natural view of what we really mean, but our feeling, our sense of free will. It is simply our conscious awareness of the processes of willing, desiring, acting, and so on start at some point. But that point is not a prime mover, like God begins the universe. That point is the point where things reached our awareness. But the chain of events started in the Big Bang, you know. I'm just not aware of that. So to me, this is the essence. And those processes that are involved in deliberating, choosing, deciding, normally are very powerful. They are deciding what I'll do. I decide, and then I act, and then things change in the world. So I don't see a very strong urge to actually elevate our conscious processes to the level of God that kind of starts chains of events by creating our universe. I think it's just the wrong way to think about it. So this is what I mean, a compatibilist view of free will. It's not an illusion, because it's not that our conscious process doesn't do anything, doesn't do any work. It's just illusion. It does do work. It's real, not all the time. Like in vision, most of the time, what we perceive is really a reflection of what is out there in the world to a good approximation. But sometimes we are fooled. We see a vase or two faces and so on and so forth. Okay, and the same with our sense of freedom or choosing or deciding. Sometimes we think we have decided, but it's consciously, but actually the action was done before it reaches our awareness. So, okay, so there are cases like that. I don't think this is the general or generic case. The generic case is that our conscious deliberation and decision is really part of the causal chain of events. Which doesn't start there, but it is part of that chain. The chain started in unconscious processes, and then at some point it reaches our awareness, and then it evokes mental states which are characteristic of conscious deliberation and decision.
But is in this worldview not the outcome predetermined already?
That what?
The outcome, is it predetermined or not? Okay, fine, it reached the consciousness. I'm thinking
outcome is predetermined. Let's forget about quantum mechanics. I don't think I don't think it is as I said, it may be exceptions, but not. It's not what happens every day that I decide whether to drink coffee or not. So the outcome is predetermined. Yes, it's predetermined. Then what? So it's predetermined. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on why all these points that you make about free will does not apply to conscious, or does not refute the idea of conscious? Because it seems to me.
I didn't say that it doesn't refute the idea of conscious. I think free will is one of the possible conscious states. You know, there is awareness, there is choosing, there is decision making. All these are part of our conscious mental processes and states. I'm not against consciousness. I don't think it has to do with the hard problem of consciousness, because this is part of the conscious process that you can look in fMRI and measure it, and you can see how it's affecting the world. I'm not saying free will is not. What I'm saying, free will, or the willing and choosing and deliberating consciously, is not a starting point of the decision process. The starting point is whatever happens before that, prior to the conscious awareness.
I understand. I just say maybe like previous points when you say like, okay, free will, you can't measure it in a dish, and you don't give it a downward causation force. Why doesn't it refute this point? Why doesn't it? They don't refute the.
Because I'll tell you why. Because the conscious process that I'm talking about is a concept which I believe emerges from the physics and biology of the nervous system. That's what I'm saying.
So you think that
you can ask what happens, let's say you can ask, okay, what happens that you are conscious of that event at this time? What happens at time, willing time of Liebe? I'll say, okay, probably there are some neural circuits that when they are active about some level, they trigger conscious experience and conscious processes and deliberations, and they affect other parts of the brain. What I'm saying, conscious, there are mental processes in our brain. Most of them are subconscious. Some of them, and particularly the ones that we care about, which we discuss now, which is deliberating and choosing and desiring and so on, they are conscious processes, but it's also part of neuroscience. It's just a different state, and heck of a different. I mean, the difference between being conscious and not conscious to us is kind of day and night, right? We turn off consciousness, we turn off ourself. So to us, rightly so, it's such a gigantic different world, being conscious versus not being conscious, being asleep versus being awake, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean, so you can call it kind of this two state, like emergent macroscopic state, and I like those, but they're all explainable in principle by physics and biology and neuroscience and so on. Now, whether I can give you an explanation now, no. There are some hypotheses, global network information, whatever. Okay, but I believe, and I think many of us believe, that eventually we'll have an account for that in purely scientific, microscopically reducible terms. It will not be a new molecule or even not a new neuron. It probably will be kind of macroscopic organization of neural circuits in connection with perception and action and so on. So I'm not saying consciousness you'll find in the dish. No, that I'm not saying. But again, remember, in physics, we have macroscopic properties which are contextual, which are only appearing in certain boundary conditions and so on and so forth. However, they are, you can trace down the origin of those contextual conditions that generate macroscopic events from the microscopic laws. You don't invoke new electrical forces to explain how you have solid or I don't know, or magnetic phases, or all kinds of, or even neutron stars. I mean, you just take the microscopic physics and find out how they give rise to these contextual macroscopic events. So I'm not saying that every phenomena that happens in the macroscopic complex physical world or biological world or in my brain, you'll find it in the dish. No, obviously it's senseless, right? You take neurons from my brain, you won't find any consciousness. But they are emergent macroscopic states of the complexity of the neural system interacting with the world, with the sensory and so on, but which are traceable to the usual laws of physics and chemistry. That's all what I'm saying. And this tracing, if I come up with a theory and with a hypothesis about this, you can measure in the lab. So if, for instance, Christoph Koch and I don't know, I think it was Francis Crick said, there are some special rhythm, 40 hertz rhythm. This is consciousness. Well, you can test it. You can change the rhythm. You can ask what is the origin of this rhythm. If somebody says what is special, I think Christoph said that for consciousness, there are special neurons. Well, you can imagine, you can image what types of neurons, you can look at, you do all that we do in usual science to test hypotheses, but all these hypotheses relate the macroscopic phenomena to microscopic mechanisms.
Haim?
Yeah.
Maybe we should have a break now, or?
Yes, I was carried out back and forth, but okay, it's a good time to take a break.
So maybe I'll say a few words just regarding the home exam. That will be, so next week we have the final lecture, and after that there's a semester break, and then we'll have the home exam. So the exam itself is for 48 hours. You get it like 9 in the morning, and you return it 48 hours afterwards. And the exact date, I'll offer a few possibilities, and we'll do a doodle, and we'll choose the date.
Okay.
That's it. I mean,
yeah. Okay, but there is I would there will be choices. Usually, I'm against choices in exams. You have to know everything. But in this case, it's kind of a complex course. Not everybody has the same level of physics background. So there will be choices. So those of you that feel more comfortable with kind of philosophical text and thinking and deliberations, and those of you that are more comfortable with equations or physics thinking, so we'll take into account to some extent the heterogeneous background.
It's also a free will course, so you have to practice your free will.
Well, we just denied the free will. We just said there's no free, that it's predetermined everything. It's just sometimes we're conscious of that process, and I'm not.
Right. Okay. We'll continue after the. No, it's an important point. We'll continue after the break, but also we'll continue about that in my final lecture. I think it is not. I think it is an important issue to think about.
I completely am convinced that we want the mental free will to be reducible to the microscopic laws and so on. But how do you know that the free will is actually like part of the chain of events? I mean, you would need, in my mind, to see like a trajectory before the conscience, before things come into conscience, and then for it to change the trajectory to change its course after it's come into the conscious knowledge, in order for you to prove that the free will is not just, a way for you to, not, I don't know if illusionary, but a way for you to have a coherent, explanation about your choices and yourself and so on.
Gili, can I suggest an experiment? But this experiment assumes there is no free will. So I think I have an experiment that if there is no free will, then you would be somehow convinced. So, but the problem with this experiment is that this assumes that we can manipulate and create it artificially. So I'm not suggesting we do it tomorrow in the lab, but let's say in 20 or 50 years, we would be able to do it. So let's say I have a way to create the qualia of free will in a subject. So I'm telling the subject to press left or right. And in half of the trials, I activate this manipulation. In the other half, I don't. And the idea of the subject is he needs to press left or right willingly, but he needs also to say whether he thinks this was a free choice or not. And if the subject cannot distinguish between the trials I created this free will in him or not, then I caused free will and the subject felt that it was free will.
Interesting. But I must say I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you or anybody reasonable denying the existence of mental conscious states? Is this the issue?
No. No, I'm saying.
Okay.
No.
Okay. And presumably you are not suggesting that this state is different from any other mental state and cannot be in principle explained by physics and chemistry, right?
Right.
Or do you?
No.
Is this the point? Is this the question? No.
No, this I accepted. Now, but you're saying that the free will is part of the chain of events, and this I don't know if you proved.
Okay, so fine. So let's think about what would be there to prove. In other words, suppose I manipulate your brain and turn off the neural circuits that are doing that. Let's say you have some decision-making circuits that deliberate and do, and now I suppress their activity. You think that the action will still follow?
The neural networks that makes the decision, or
yeah, well, yes. So you know, you have sensory, you have some stimulus, then you have some associative circuits in the brain. They get input from memory, from the value system, from emotion. They integrate that. They make a decision. The decision goes into the motor cortex, and they cause a twitch in the muscles, and I move my hand. Okay, that's kind of okay. So now you're saying prove that this process was really part of the chain of events. So I could just suppress the activity of those networks, and you think that they will still, the motor action will still be.
No, I'm saying this whole chain of events will happen, but I'm asking about this point in time where things go into your conscience, whether there would be a change in the trajectory.
But at that point of time, my brain state changes from unconscious to conscious. You agreed that these are two different neural states. So nothing. So how come you won't be able to measure them? I don't understand. You have to make a decision. If you believe that the conscious state has foundations in the neural activity and the unconscious state is another pattern of activity, then what else do I have to show?
I'm saying there could be a neural state where I smell chocolate and then my hand goes and grabs chocolate, right? Now, and in this chain of events, somewhere could come also into account also this point that you mentioned where my consciousness comes into play. So I am saying that if once my consciousness comes into play, I can also, not take the chocolate, then this is a proof that my consciousness, did some action here, has some causal, but if regardless.
I disagree, Gili.
No.
You can think of a simple neural motif that creates this, that you like a feed-forward inhibition and like something very simple that creates a delayed vetoing. You don't need consciousness for that.
Okay, but if it doesn't happen.
I don't know. Look, when I say that this is part of the causal chain of events, I did not say that you could come back to that point and choose differently. It's purely deterministic trajectory. So you have to suggest a perturbation, or else you have to say, which is possible in principle, which is an empirical question. And this is the following, that in this trajectory, you might manipulate the electrical activity pattern in a subtle way so that things will not reach my conscious awareness, but nevertheless will be the same. The behavior will come out the same. So the neural deliberation will still work, the decision, the desiring, everything will work without me being conscious of that. This will be an empirical, scientific validation that my conscious willing and decision and so on is not causally effective. It will be a remarkable result, and I'll have to accept it. Okay.
I just wanted to note that the first experiment which was suggested was already performed on live stage. Do you know all the magicians which prime the audience into doing something, and then the audience thinks they're doing a free will decision of imagining sure. Or think, and then you see how the magicians already do magic.
Sure.
That's like they made you into making this free will decision. So just to answer the first experiment, this experiment was already made. It's public on YouTube. You can find those musicians who are priming people into thinking that they're making free will decisions. And it doesn't prove, I didn't disprove at least humanity of not having free will.
No, I agree. There are Daniel Wagner from Harvard has a whole book, Illusion of Free Will, where he collects all these historically and contemporary examples where you are being fooled of your agency. Like, people sit around the table and they're able to lift the table, and they are convinced that they're really lifting the table by their will, by their thinking, and so on and so forth. So I am not saying that every time we think or we have the feeling that our will, our decision is the causal force of the events, it's true. No, we can be fooled. However,
no, I just wanted to answer the first suggestion, which was
but I am answering the second one, which is also good. But what I'm saying is, if you are able to show that under normal conditions, the conscious part of the process is really epiphenomenon, that you could manipulate the electrical activity and having this chain of events in the brain and then in action without me being aware of that. That will be a remarkable result. That's an empirical question. It will be a remarkable result. And yes, this will have to revise our notion of what consciousness is what role it has in our action.
But why is poking an electrode in your brain and doing it like different than I'm taking a good hypnotist? What's the difference?
A good what?
Hypnotist, somebody who is hypnotizing people. Yes, what's the difference? Okay, I'm manipulating them with an electrode or taking a hypnotist.
I do not see myself choosing to go to university and study 3 years to be a physicist or a chemist or so on under hypnosis. I don't think that will happen. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'd like to add one comment or two. So first, I think that every time we choose an experiment or a model, it needs to be very clear at what level of degrees of freedom we are using, because speaking, sorry for the noise, speaking on electrical activity and conscious feeling, I think, might be confusing. So this should be really well defined. What is the information that we include in the model, and what is the information that we leave out? So it's just.
Well, I agree about the general comment, but the whole course is about the fact that we are able to make those connections in principle. No, I agree that we have to be. We have to design such experiment very carefully, but.
I'll also add that I think that the information part should probably, in an ideal model, I see it like as a part of the components of the model. But yeah, I'm coming from this group, so
no, I'm not. I take your point. I'm not suggesting now experimental paradigm in its full detail. I'm just saying the broad issue that is raised here, and I think correctly, is whether the fact, the conscious aspect of the mental processes is something that is not part of the causal. Is it part of the causal chain? Not part of the causal chain. And I don't see a way to disentangle myself on those, because I believe that on normal circumstances, when I'm making a decision, when I'm deliberating, when I'm choosing, the whole brain is active, and you cannot disentangle. But in order to show me wrong, you will have to find an experiment where you are able to turn off the conscious searchlight in my brain, and nevertheless everything else will be the same. I do not think so. There are, for instance, a lot of experiments, beautiful experiments in modern cognitive neuroscience that shows that unconscious processes can achieve a lot of things. You can have perceptions, you can bias primes, and even do some minimal algebra, bigger on smaller, without being awareness, with pure awareness.
How do they measure whether the subject are conscious or not?
That's a good question.
That's
a good question. That's a good question. The normal one is basically done by reporting, which is by itself is a problematic, whether this is good or not. So there are direct reporting or indirect reporting. It's a good point. But I do not. But all these, kind of working memory kind of thing, very short-term, primitive aspects of perception. But I do not see how the richness of our decisions and deliberations can be in the brain without being disentangled with the conscious aspect of it. I think they come together now. I don't know how to. I don't even know how you disentangle. You will have to do experiments and to show that the whole thing will be going on in my brain and will make the same decisions and action without me being aware. I doubt it very much, but that's what will take to. That's what it will take. Anyway.
When you say that it's all deterministic, you mean that also the mental deliberations,
of course,
once things are coming into
the whole thing is deterministic. It's not. There is no such a thing that at this point, if I went back to this point, I would choose differently. No, you choose the same, but you choose.
So the free will is just
here's if you want what I think in broad sense. Human actions are free to the extent that they are outcome of conscious deliberations and reasoning when the subject possesses a normal capacity of reflection and rational thinking, or They are the outcome of subconscious processes like instinctive, non-deliberative actions that themselves are influenced by memorized past conscious deliberation processes, as in one. In other words, let's say sometimes I subconsciously, I don't even think, I'm not aware, I'm doing something in a certain pattern. Now, this action, I wasn't really conscious about it, but nevertheless, my pattern of behavior is the outcome of my previous deliberations and training and biases and education and all this. I call it free. The notion free here is to contrast it with things which are reflexive, which don't involve any of these conscious mental processes of deliberation and reason, or sometimes they are part of the deliberation, but in abnormal brain. So imagine you have a schizophrenic patient, subject, that makes a deliberation and decides to, I don't know, to hide under his bed because he believes that CIA is chasing him. So it is a deliberate action, but under abnormal circumstances. The capacity of the brain was not in the normal state. So that's what I mean. This is when my action is free. When my finger is in a fire and I reflexively take it away, withdraw my arm or my finger, this is not a free will. It's not a free choice. It's not a free act. It is to say that this is a free action or free choice or free will is to characterize the type of mental processes that went into the preparation of the action. Not all our actions are free in that sense, not because they are not determined, because they don't involve that type of deliberation and decision making. Then actions which are not free. So if I'm under the influence of the drug, if a drug addict, okay, is deliberating whether to kill somebody in order to get access to the substance. This action is free because he was deliberating and he knew the consequences and he was aware of the consequences and he made his choice. But if he's under the influence of the drug and kills somebody, then he's not free because those actions didn't engage those processes which we are attaching the significance of being free. I think that's kind of the broad picture. And of course, there are details and there are, it's fuzzy at the edges and there are a lot of literature and many questions that you can ask, but that's the essence of it. This is what we mean, but we say we freely acted or when we're not, we didn't freely act. Okay, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, wouldn't you agree that those conscious deliberations and reasoning are themselves an outcome of subconscious processes that are...
They are, of course they are.
So why do you put a difference when a drug addict makes something under the influence and not under the influence? Both of them are a result of some subconscious dynamics in his brain and so on.
But what enters into the deliberation is abnormal influences. This is why I won't call it.
So it's like abnormal dynamics.
Exactly. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But maybe who says what's normal or abnormal dynamics in the brain?
Yeah, now we just need to define that and.
No, fine. So it's fuzzy, and I don't. This is something intuitive. I agree. It's not clear cut, and you can question the definition of normal and not normal. It's our, I think, intuition or my intuition, and I want, I won't defend this particular definition or where the border are, when the boundary are, because I'm not sure it is so important. If I am taking a legal or moral stand, or if I'm a judge and a case comes to me and I have to decide whether this guy is responsible for his acts, then we'll have to put the boundaries. Why this is normal and this is not normal and so on. I agree, it is maybe a more practical question and so on.
It sounds like a scientific question also. Maybe in the phase space of brain dynamics, you can put some cut between normal and abnormal.
It's possible. It's quite possible. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sure there are, there are extreme cases where you can, where you can actually convince yourself that whatever what's going on in the brain at that time is so devoid from connection to reality that it should not be considered, a normal deliberation. But there will be a lot of, fuzziness in it, and that's life. I agree. This is part which is not necessarily. Nimrod is right. There may be cases where you can say there's a phase transition in the dynamics, but not every time there will be the case. So it will be more practical question. How do we make a person accountable under these conditions, and our boundaries and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think the notion is kind of fluid, but it captures, I think, our intuition when we say, well, this is something that we are responsible for with. And sometimes we act when we're not responsible for. So if somebody, for instance, this is not the same as the notion is related but different from the question of legal responsibility. So for instance, if somebody comes to a person and says, well, you can choose A or B, but if you choose B, I don't know, I do some harm to your family. Okay, and then obviously the guy will choose A. Okay, I think it was a free choice because the person was deliberating the circumstances, the coercion, and made her decision. But I'm not saying that he's morally responsible. No, of course, we understand the circumstances. But the mental process was the normal mental process, was reflecting the reality. Unlike somebody that's under the drug or schizophrenic and so on, delusional and so on, that the input to the deliberation process was not really connected or reflecting the reality. So if Hadar wants to say information theory, maybe, the relation between the activity of the brain and events in the world. So it's not the same as moral responsibility. Free will, the notion of free will is what actions, choices that we make are really coming from us and are on our account. And then there is an issue whether we are legally or morally responsible. Some of them, yes, and some of them. So if we did not act freely, we are unlikely to be morally responsible, but we may have acted freely, nevertheless not responsible. In the cases that I said, that we acted under coercion, but nobody forces our hand. We had such circumstances that we had no choice but to make a decision like this. Okay, but it was part of a rational, normal deliberation. That's the way I think about it. Let me the question that we had here are related to the question of fatalism. There is a well-known argument against determinism. And the argument, again, it reflects the sentiments that some of the discussion here. If everything is determined, then why bother? So in this case, it's known as the well-known as idle argument, and it has classical roots already. And the argument is, if it's fated that you will recover from this illness, then you will recover whether you go to a doctor or not. If the fate is that you will recover, then even if you don't go to a doctor, you will recover. If the fate is that you will not recover, then the doctor will not help you. That's a classical roots in classical thoughts. And if I have time, next week I'll show you reflections of that in the writings of Maimonides, Rambam. The same sentiments. It's called the idle argument. And somebody wanted to participate in this course, and he said, I don't have time, I'm busy, whatever, and so on. But I always wanted to know, if there is no free will, why should I get out of my bed in the morning? Why should I get out of my bed? Why should I bother? Things will happen as they anyway were fated to happen. So I think there is a flaw in this classical argument. And the reason is, first of all, the fatalism imagines that things will happen without our acting. So for instance, we will be cured without taking the medicine because it's fated. But it's false, because things were also fated that I will be cured by taking the medicine. So you cannot disconnect the chain of event and say, well, things will happen and therefore I don't have to act. If you are not, Rambam, Maimonides brings the example, if there is no free will, then why should you avoid danger? Why should you escape from danger? Or why should you work to get a profession or to get a living? But obviously, if you are not going to get a living, then you will not going to have support yourself and family and so on. So first of all, acting, things will not happen if you're not acting by themselves. But even more than that, as I said before, many things will not happen if you will not be involved, engaged in volition and decision making, and so on. And therefore, yeah, just let me finish the last point of that slide. Sometimes people say, well, so why we are educating, why we send kids to the schools? I mean, what is the point? I mean, they will behave, they will turn out to be either good or educated or not educated. If everything is determined, why we are trying to convince our fellows, what is the point of getting reward and punishment? But it's all a mistake. It's all an error, because in the deterministic world, education works as it should work, through our senses, through our long-term memory, through our thinking, plastic brain, and so on. And reward and punishment is also part of the sensory input that the brain incorporates in making its decisions. So all this, I think, refutes the notion of fatalism. So the notion that if everything is determined, then we are, as agent, completely inert, completely not causal. We should not get out of bed and something magically will happen. We should not go to a doctor. We should not study. We should not do anything because it will happen. No, it will not happen without us. Okay, there was a question here.
I think the flaw in the argument is it's much more basic. I think the flaw is that if let's say that it's fated that you're cured from your illness, and let's say that the only way to be cured from an illness is getting to the doctor, then you don't know if what is fated. You don't have the information now about what would happen tomorrow. So you don't know the fate, but let's say there is a fate and everything is deterministic. So you don't have free will to go to the doctor or not get to the doctor. Like either you go to the doctor and then you're cured, or you're not going to the doctor and then you're not cured. But this argument separates them and says that it's like A is deterministic and B is not deterministic. So it's a logical flaw. It's not about even participating. Like either there is free will for everything or there is no free will for everything.
No, I don't disagree. I think it's the same argument. It's a logical flaw. I agree with you, because if you believe in determinism, as you should, my view, then everything is determined. So you cannot. So there are events are caused by prior events. So the logical flaw is to say, well, because it is determined, then somehow the event will occur without their prior events, without the causal chain.
No, I'm saying that you are allowed to stay in your bed and don't be educated and don't go to the doctor. You are allowed to do everything. You just don't know, you just know in advance your fate. Like you assume that your fate would be positive, but then you say, if the fate is already positive, why should I do all the hard stuff? But you don't know the fate is positive.
No. But the idle argument says in both cases. Say, well, it may be negative. The idle argument is in both cases. Let's suppose the fate is that I'm not cured. So why should I go to the doctor if I'm not cured?
But you don't know, that's the case. You don't know your
but
fate.
If the fate is that I will be cured, so why should I go to the doctor anyway?
Because you don't. Because if you believe in determinism, you don't have a choice to go or not to go. I think that's the problem.
Okay, I agree. Okay, so I think you're pointing to an important issue, which I will defer to next week, and this is. There are two questions. There are two types of questions. One is the causal efficacy of our action. The notion that because of the determinism, then we don't have a role. Whatever we do, something will happen. This is flawed. Okay, because without our action, nothing will happen. In other words, whatever without our effort, whether it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. Even bad things sometimes happen because of our action, and they will not happen without our action. There is another issue which is more subtle, and this is given that, what shall we do? Or what shall we think? Or what shall we decide? The content. This is more subtle, and I think Shaked is alluding to this issue. Okay. So everything is deterministic. So what shall I do? What choice shall I make? That has to do with what you say about whether you know or don't know the future. And I think these two problems are conflated and should be different. So from external perspective, obviously without our action, bad or good, things will not happen, and without our decision, most of the time, we will not generate the behavior, and so on and so forth. But then you can ask, okay, so what shall I do? What shall I think? What shall I deliberate? Things anyway are deterministic. This has to do, I believe, with the question of Shaked, and this has to do with to the extent that we are knowledgeable or not knowledgeable about the future. But I think this point we should, I would like to develop more next week. There is a separate set of questions about what is moving the world, our actions, and to a large degree, the brain processes that lead to our actions. And in many cases, those brain processes involve conscious processes and deliberation and so on and so forth. These are the external view of the causal chain of events. There is a more internal view is, what shall we deliberate? How shall we make a decision? What is the right decision? What is the wrong decision? What are the criteria for that? In a deterministic world, I think that question, the intrinsic question, the first person question, what should be the content of my deliberation? I know everything, I know the science, I know that whatever I'll do, that's the way things were predetermined to be, fine. So what shall I deliberate? What are decisions which make sense and decisions that don't make sense? Or everything makes sense because the world, if I'm making a decision and something happens, then it was predetermined like that, right? So that's the question of the rationality or the internal coherence and consistency of the deliberation process itself. I think that's an interesting problem. And I think this is the challenging problem, in my view, because the causal picture, I think most of us as scientists understand that anything that comes in the brain are outcome of neural processes and so on and so forth. But when we act like agents and have to make decisions, it's not enough to tell us, look, everything is determined. Okay, but what decision shall I make? What is the criteria? Is there a criteria of reasonable decision or not reasonable decision in a biologically determined world? This is a normative question, not a mechanistic question, a normative question. A question, what should I do? What should I choose? Are there criteria to this question? The ought question. Not why, but what ought. The normative question. I think this is very much related to what Shaked, to your point, is, and it has to do with what kind of information I have about the context, not only the past, but also the future. All right, המשך יבוא, to be continued.